let's take a look at the brain and some corresponding structures that will encase it. So this model depicts on the left hemisphere here, the brain without the meningeal layers. So the meninges, there are 3 layers. From superficial to deep, it's the dura mater, then the arachnoid mater, and then the PIA mater. So the outermost layer, or the most superficial layer, is the dura mater. That means tough mother. So it's the most robust layer of the 3 meningeal layers that will be surrounding the brain. On the right hemisphere, or the left side of our view, we can see the arachnoid mater. So the arachnoid mater will contain a large amount of vascularization that we can visualize here. And then deep to that, which we can't see, is the PIA mater. So the PIA mater is going to lie right on the surface of the brain. It's a very thin layer. If you do a sheep brain dissection, you can see just how intimately associated the PIA mater is with the nervous tissue of the brain. These meningeal layers will also dive down into other anatomical structures in the brain. So on this model, we can remove what's called the falx cerebri. So this is the falx cerebri, and that dives down into the longitudinal fissure of the brain that separates the 2 hemispheres. On this model, we can see the meningeal layers that traverse throughout various anatomical locations surrounding the brain more closely. So in this model, we can see that all of the nervous tissue has been removed, and all that remains are the meningeal structures that will be found in various neuroanatomical locations. So on the previous model, I showed you the falx cerebri. That's also present on this model, forming a mohawk-like structure. And we can see the venous return structures of the cardiovascular system here, the superior sagittal sinus and the inferior sagittal sinus. And those are going to be integral to regulating the amount of cerebrospinal fluid that can enter into the ventricular system surrounding the CNS. We can also see here some meningeal structures that are going to overlie the 2 hemispheres of the cerebellum, or little brain, that will be involved with regulating motor movement. And you can visualize how this tentorium cerebelli kind of serves as a tent over the 2 hemispheres of the cerebellum. So like the falx cerebri, there's also going to be a meningeal layer that separates the 2 hemispheres of the cerebellum, and that's going to be called the falx cerebelli, and that's going to reside in this location in life. Okay, so those are the meningeal structures that will be involved with the central nervous system. This model of the brain is color-coded to highlight some important structures that you should be aware of. First, let's start with the lobes. So in orange here, we have depicted the frontal lobe of the brain. So that's going to be bounded posteriorly by what's called the central sulcus. So on the brain, there are going to be gyri, or ridges, and there are going to be valleys, which are sulci, or if it's just one, a sulcus. And this particular sulcus is called the central sulcus, and that's going to be the posterior boundary of the frontal lobe. And the anterior boundary of the frontal lobe will be the most highly evolved area of the brain, which is the prefrontal cortex. That's going to be involved with executive function, decision making, etc. Posterior to the central sulcus here, we can see another lobe, and that is the parietal lobe. Most laterally here, we can see the temporal lobe. This is going to be important for the auditory system, as well as the consolidation of memories via the structure called the hippocampus, which will be found in the medial temporal lobe. Posteriorly here, we can see the occipital lobe. And this area of the brain, which will be bounded anteriorly here by the parieto-occipital sulcus, is going to play a major role in the visual system. Some more isolated structures here that we can visualize on this model are Broca's area. So this is found on the lateral side of the left frontal lobe, and this area is going to be vital for the motor production of speech. So if there are deficits to this area of the brain, there is going to be a pathology in the ability to formulate spoken words. So I mentioned on the right hemisphere of the brain that this structure is called the central sulcus, and in addition to separating both the frontal and parietal lobes, it's also going to be the boundary between two important gyri here. So this is the precentral gyrus, and this is the primary motor cortex, and this is the postcentral gyrus, and this is the primary somatosensory cortex. And what's unique about these particular areas of the brain is that the way it's laid out, or the way that they are laid out, is in a topographical fashion. So there's what's called a homunculus, or little man. So if you can visualize the head of a little man here, the body of a little man traveling more medially, and then the legs and the feet of the little man diving down into the longitudinal fissure to be present on the medial side of the hemisphere of the brain here, you'd get an idea for when activity in these particular areas is present, where, if this brain were in a PET scan, for example, where that activity would be found. So if someone were to tickle my face, for example, on my primary somatosensory cortex here, in a brain scan, we would see this area of the brain light up. If someone were to scratch my leg, for example, we'd see activity more in this region of the brain. So it's laid out like a person on this gyrus. On the temporal lobe here, we can see the primary auditory cortex and the auditory association area surrounding it. And posteriorly here, we can see, in addition to the two hemispheres of the cerebellum, so here's the left hemisphere, and here's the right hemisphere, and that tentorium cerebelli is going to be the meningeal layer that will overlie the two hemispheres of the cerebellum. We can also see the primary visual cortex. This is also referred to as V1. So this is going to be a major structure in the visual pathway from the eyes. So this is a mid-sagittal view of the brain. So it's as if someone took a cut right down the longitudinal fissure of the brain and divided it into two hemispheres of equal size. So we can see a lot of the internal structures of the brain from this view. So starting more inferiorly here, we are at the level of the brainstem. So the brainstem is going to consist of the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. Those are the three structures that comprise the brainstem. And so in the medulla oblongata here, we can see a continuation of the ventricular system from the spinal cord, which is the central canal. The central canal will then drain into an enlargement of the ventricular system here, anterior to the cerebellum, which is kind of a wedge-shaped structure. And that is the fourth ventricle. On the cerebellum, we can see this branching tree-like structure, and that's called the arbor vitae. So that means tree of life in Latin, and that's what we can visualize in this white paint here. From the fourth ventricle, cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, can travel through this structure called the cerebral aqueduct. So once the ventricular system gets to the area adjacent to the midbrain, it is now the cerebral aqueduct, and that will drain into this area of empty space. So when the brain is intact, this area will actually be empty, and it will be in between the two hemispheres of the thalamus. So the thalamus is this enlargement here, and there are two hemispheres of that, and it's going to connect to the right hemisphere, as this is the left hemisphere of the brain here, via a structure called the interthalamic adhesion, or the massa intermedia. So this area is actually going to be solid in the intact brain. But that ventricular system structure that will be present in between the two hemispheres of the thalamus is the third ventricle. So this was the fourth ventricle, cerebral aqueduct, into the third ventricle, in between the two hemispheres of the thalamus. Some other structures in the area adjacent to the midbrain are the colliculi. So we can only see two of them here, and you can see them a little bit better from a posterior view. They kind of bulge out. This is the superior colliculus, and this is the inferior colliculus, involved with the visual pathway and the auditory pathway, respectively. And when all four of them are intact, they're called the corpora quadrigemina. So we're only seeing two of the four structures that comprise the corpora quadrigemina, so quad meaning four. 23 here is the pineal gland. So it's a small structure, but it's going to be important for regulating our sleep-wake cycle through an endocrine hormone called melatonin. So the pineal gland, or the epithalamus, is going to secrete melatonin. Number 13 here represents commissural fibers. So commissural fibers are going to be those that cross the midline. So they're going to be traveling out of the screen here and going towards the right hemisphere of the brain. And this is the posterior commissure, In this pinkish paint here, we have depicted the choroid plexus. So this is going to be the structure that's going to be involved with producing cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. This roof over the thalamus here of white matter is called the fornix. And this very thick band of white matter, which will cross the midline, is the corpus callosum. So all of this is the corpus callosum. In this area, there's going to be a membrane, a very thin membrane in life, that will separate the anterior horns of the lateral ventricle, called the septum pellucidum. The septum pellucidum. And this structure, number 9, is also representing some commissural fibers. This one is the anterior commissure. So this is going to send fibers to the right hemisphere of the brain as well. I mentioned that this structure is the thalamus. Well, below that is the hypothalamus. So hypo means below. This is the hypothalamus. It's going to play a role in the endocrine system, and it's going to have a connection to one of the major endocrine glands in the body, which is the pituitary gland. This is the pituitary gland, and it's connected to the hypothalamus via a structure called the infundibulum. the infundibulum. Here we can see one of the two mammillary bodies, and this is one of the two components of cranial nerve 2. So this is one of the optic nerves going out to one of the two eyes. Some other structures we can see on the mid-sagittal view of the brain here are the limbic lobe. So this area of the brain is called the limbic lobe. And we can also see the sulcus that will divide the occipital lobe from the parietal lobe. And that is the occipito-parietal sulcus, the boundary between those two lobes. So those are the structures that we can see on the mid-sagittal view of the brain.